Our story is going to begin. I just wanted to mention that probably the two definitive books on the stories of both of these. The first one is called But He Was Good to His Mother. Now, there's a lot more known about Jewish gangsters. Again, not Bugsy, Meyer Lansky, and I'll mention a few other Jewish ones who are fairly well known, but this book really is like the definitive one. Not that there's not other academic research out there, but in terms of the popular book, if you want to learn more about this, it's this, But He Was Good to His Mother. And although we're going to talk about pirates in the second half, there's a lot less known about Jewish pirates, even though it was very much a thing. And a lot of the evidence came out somewhat recently and was put in this book, which it's a few years old now, but 2000s, Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean, or Caribbean, depending on whether you're on the Disney ride or not. But again, these are the two quintessential books if you're interested in learning more about either of these topics. But now, as I said, I want to look into some highlights. So the first, or before highlights, the first question is, what led these young Jewish boys, they really usually started as boys, into joining the mob? And the answers are not always, there's usually more than one factor, but the answer is pretty simple. There's kind of one main thing is they were all mostly in New York. They weren't necessarily all born in New York, but they had connections to New York, or they moved to New York. They lived mostly on the Upper East Side with a lot of other immigrants. And in general, organized crime, which some of it came over from Italy because they had organized crime there, but a lot of it came out of these immigrant communities. And the reason was because they were immigrants, they did not have the access to money, to jobs, to education, to housing, to anything that people living here. It's unfortunately a problem that still exists today. And saying, oh, just work hard and you'll get there. Unfortunately, even today, that's not the answer. There are limitations on certain people who are seen as outsiders, whether because of where they came from, the color of their skin, their religion. In this case, they are never allowed to join the greater group, but they need to feed their families. So many, many immigrants said, look, if you're not going to let me take the regular path, the legal path, I'm going to make something happen. Now, one thing I want to make very clear here, in no way am I going to justify the actions of these men. Because as someone's working very hard to raise money for their family, they may do things that are very questionable. But a lot of these Jewish guys did things that are beyond just robbing a bank or roughing someone up. There were some dark things that we will not go into, even worse than murder things. So at some point, it's not just a matter of I'll do anything to save my family. If you want that story, read Les Miserables. But if you want a story of guys who said, look, there's no future for me here, and they also had a pretty dark side to them, those are the men we're looking at here. So in the 20s and 30s, there was no path out of the ghetto, basically, unless you made one for yourself, and you usually couldn't make it on the main street. So a lot of these Jews looked for illegal crime. Now, there weren't enough Jews in it initially to start their own organized crime, so they often went to work for the big existing families. And that leads to our first guy here, Red Levine. So Red Levine was a Jewish hitman. And again, he worked for one of the big families, Murder Inc., which had a lot of Jews in it. But again, they connected their fates to Italian families. And it's interesting is you might see the movies about all these Italian mafias, Godfather and everything like that. But behind the scenes, in almost every major family in the 20s and 30s, there was at least one or two significant Jews, not just somebody cursorily connected. As we'll see in a short video we'll see in just a moment, these Jews had major, major roles and became mob leaders in their own right. But the reason I'm starting with Red Levine is because in general, almost without question, all of these Jewish gangsters had nothing to do with their Judaism. They knew they were Jewish. They were trying to escape the ghetto. Their goal wasn't to escape Judaism, but they were secular, as many, many Jews in America and children of immigrants were, because it was really hard to stay observant and to have a fruitful, fulfilling life and make a living. But at least the story goes about Red Levine, the reputation he has is while he was a criminal and a murderer, there was one day of the week when he would not kill or do any mob stuff, and that was supposed to be Shabbos. Now, again, was that true? We're not sure, but there's a lot of stories about it. But this it's not only a cool little anecdote, but it almost proves, it's the exception to the rule kind of thing, which is that these gangsters had nothing to do with their Judaism unless it was convenient or the fact that they happened to be Jewish or anti-Semitism. And unfortunately, that was a big factor in it. It's not just that it was hard for them to get jobs. It was often dangerous. It still is dangerous to be a Jew. They would get beat up, they would get threatened. And as you'll see with Meyer Lansky, that actually he found a non-Jew who was willing to protect him despite the fact that he was Jewish. So the next thing we're going to do is a short little movie. It's only about 4 minutes. It's animated, but it gives an amazing summary, an amazing summation about who this Meyer Lansky is and how did he make his way to the top. And what's really interesting is, when did his Jewish identity matter to him? And again, there's a lot of stuff left out, but this video is basically the trajectory of most Jewish gangsters. They all kind of follow the same thing. There's no future in the ghetto. I gotta get out. The Italian mob is where it's at. If I had something to offer them and I'm loyal, I can make it. Before we start the video though, are there any questions up until now? Excellent. So let's start the video. Ken, I'm gonna look at your picture. If there's any issues with the sound or video or anything like that, just give me some signal. Otherwise, give me a thumbs up that everyone can hear.
Growing up in Lower East Manhattan at the time wasn't exactly ideal. You had 2 square miles crowded with immigrants, mostly Irish, Italians, and Jews. Young Meyer did fairly well in school and was said to be good with numbers. However, like most kids from his neighborhood, he didn't really aim at an academic career in life. The roots of Lansky's future ties with the world of gambling may be found in a story he used to tell of how he was given a nickel by his mother the night before the Jewish Sabbath to pay a baker for the use of the heat. On his way, Lansky saw a couple of kids playing a game of craps on the sidewalk. He put in his nickel and of course immediately lost it. There was to be no war meal the following day, and the whole family knew that it was his fault. Lansky felt like a fool and vowed never to gamble again, although he did kinda like the idea of taking other suckers' money instead. On the streets of New York City, Meyer made several acquaintances who would later become a sort of underground celebrities. Among these was Charles Lucky Luciano, who back then ran a gang of Sicilian immigrant boys which extorted money from Jewish kids. Legend says that the short and frail-looking Meyer stood up to the Sicilians, upon which he and Lucky almost instantly took a liking to each other. Meyer frequently organized backroom craps games, and as his reputation grew, he and a couple of his guys were often hired by local unions to beat up the men who worked in factories during strikes. Another of Meyer's later famous acquaintances was a Jewish boy by the name of Bugsy Siegel, who Meyer befriended when helping him escape from the police. Soon after Lansky and Bugsy met came the Prohibition, pretty much the golden era of organized crime in the United States. Lansky told Bugsy that there was a need for them to organize in the same manner as the Irish and the Italians, so they formed the famous Bugs and Meyer mob. The Bugs and Meyer gang was involved in several different criminal activities, including bootlegging, gambling, and contract murders. The most notable of these contract murders was the killing of an Italian capo di tutti capi. Since the faces of Lansky's Jewish hitmen were unknown by most of the Italians, they were the most suitable option for carrying out the hit. They pretended to be taxmen and were led in the building, where they disarmed the boss's men, entered his office, and shot and stabbed him to death. The assassination quickly propelled Meyer's friend Lucky to power as the leading figure of New York's 5 crime families. By this time, the two had developed even closer ties, as they were both key figures in the forming of the National Crime Syndicate in 1934. Once the Prohibition had ended, Meyer Lansky wanted to focus on what he knew best: running gambling operations. He knew all the games and odds very well and had protection from the mob. What more do you really need? Following the revolution, Lansky returned to the States, where he became closely watched by the FBI. They tapped his phones and formed a team whose sole purpose was to gather evidence on him, who they believed was the chief financial officer of a colossal underground network. But this was extremely hard to prove because Lansky looked like he was, well, retired. The most interesting thing they saw him do was walk his dog and occasionally wave to the press. However, Lansky felt that the constant digging of the feds would pay off and decided to seek asylum in Israel. By the law of return, every Jew seeking an Israeli citizenship would be granted one. But this wouldn't be the case for Lansky. After 2 years of US pressure, the Israeli Supreme Court ruled that Lansky was not welcome. Upon his deportation back to America, Lansky was accused of tax evasion and skimming casino profits, but was acquitted of both due to an unreliable witness and deteriorating health. Outliving most of his friends and associates, Lansky died of lung cancer in Miami Beach in 1983. Some say he died with just a couple of thousand to his name. Others say he had more than 300 million hidden in Swiss offshore bank accounts. Some say he was the mob's accountant, while others say he was for a time the leading figure in organized crime. Who knows? One thing is for certain though, whether good, bad, moral or immoral, Meyer Lansky, a short Polish Jew from the Lower East Side, achieved what he set out to do.
Excellent. Now, there are a few important things to point out there. Now, that first story talks about getting a nickel before Shabbos to buy food, and he ends up in a craps game. May or may not be true. It's probably some version of the truth. However, what is true is, again, that a lot of these Jews were growing up on the Upper East Side, and they were poor as could be. And they needed some way to get out. Now, he was able to develop a nice education and everything like that, but ultimately, he decided that the best way to use it was towards crime. Now, one of the things this video pointed out in the end is we're not sure exactly, was he rich at the end, poor at the end? Was he an accountant? Was he one of the greatest mob bosses in history? The thing is, when you're learning the history of men and women who do illegal criminal things, they don't want you to know what they do. So part of their very profession is hiding their truth from history. So a lot of this has to be pieced together. A lot of this is hypothesized. But we do know enough to put together a general story about Meyer Lansky. And one of the things I mentioned, and this became a huge, well-known story at the time, I don't know if anyone here remembers when it happened, is when he wanted to make Aliyah. So one of the things I cut out of the video is when he was in Vegas, he was doing great, had an amazing reputation. He actually bribed the neighbors to not complain about the gambling casinos. Rather than trying to, just push it in there, he said, I'll pay you $50, ignore the casino. Went good for years. Eventually things got hot. He moved to Cuba, where things went great until the revolution, and the communists at the time kicked him out. That's when he wanted to go to Israel. But again, he didn't care about being Jewish until it was convenient for him. And oftentimes that's what criminals do. They do whatever is convenient. Now, why do we know about Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel? I mean, there were only a handful of Jews. Was it because they really did, like throughout Jewish history, like the story of Joseph, like we're reading in the Torah right now, like this one little Jew from prison becomes one of the most powerful men in the world? Is that a true thing? And the answer is a little bit yes. We actually have, not just in the Torah, but throughout history, famous Jewish men who they're just poor little Jews, but through their wisdom and hard work and connections with other countries because of other Jews, Rambam, a man named Shmuel Hanagid, they became second in command in some of the greatest kingdoms and empires throughout history. So maybe there's some of that. Maybe the Jews were just able, like always, maybe with God's help, to work their way up to high positions of power. But also, unlike petty crime, the mafia wasn't millions of people. It was maybe dozens, maybe hundreds. And it's become a pretty sexy thing for movies to talk about. They're actually coming out with a new Meyer Lansky movie. And they have the show Sopranos. People love learning about the mob. So if you have a handful of men who stand out, it's interesting to know about them. And the other thing is, because the Jews were different, the Italian mob often took advantage of that. If they wanted to send a hit squad and you see a bunch of, Italian men, clearly Italian immigrants walk in, oh, they're probably with the mob. But if you see this little Polish guy walk in, you think he's going to sell me some deli or something like that, and then he kills you. So the Jews throughout history have had a unique position, usually for good, but in some cases for some pretty evil, dark stuff. But it's still an important chapter in our history, and it shows how Jews can always have an outside role, again, whether they're using it for good or bad, in this case bad, but it's a fascinating part of our history. And fortunately, it's not a major part of our history, and it did not last very long, but it is something that we need to own as part of Jewish history, is these handful of men that turned to crime. Ultimately, it came from, I don't want to say a good place, but a need that we all share, which is to escape poverty, to have a better life. Again, what they did can't be justified, but we can understand why they did it. So before we go on to piracy, any questions up until now? Excellent. So hold on. Let's see if we go to the, oh, excellent. Well, this is a great story. I'll just summarize this one. There was an interesting part of as the mafia, again, these Jews who were in the mafia became quite powerful. Usually all they did was try and get money and be powerful. And as I said, for Meyer Lansky, the only time he really cared about being Jewish is when it was convenient for him to get out of the country and go to a safe haven, being Israel, but that's not entirely true. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter how secular a Jew is. Oftentimes, they still recognize that in their kishkas, they say the Pintalayid, they're still part of the Jewish people, whether or not they keep all of the laws. So when the state of Israel was fighting for its survival, there are actually a number of stories about these mafia men or about these Israeli soldiers or Israelis going to the States. And because of the politics of the Middle East, they couldn't just be given guns. They couldn't just buy guns. The Arab armies had all the guns they wanted, and they could buy them anywhere they wanted to from all these countries, but no one would sell to the Jews, or in very limited number. So the Jews had to get them any way they could, or they'd be wiped off the face of the earth. So oftentimes, or a number of times, they turn to the mafia. And there are a number of stories. And here's actually an amazing article in Tablet Mag that goes into it more. But it talks about this guy meeting in an apartment. And he's meeting with a member of murder. Actually, it's funny, the last line here. He told Robinson that the men he met with, who offered money and weapons to help support the Israelis build up their country, came from a Brooklyn-based organization. I think they're called Murder Limited. Not being an American New Yorker, Arazi had made an error in the title of Murder Incorporated or Murder Inc. So it's just that funny little story. They were like what, Murder United or something like that. Murder Inc. The most famous Murder Inc. The entire purpose of that specific gang was to do hit jobs. Literally, whatever your mafia did, you owned gambling casinos, whatever it is, but you needed somebody killed, you go to Murder Inc. They're literally a company for killing your competitors, and they were quite good at it. But they were also, they were basically run by the Jews. And in fact, one of them, I believe, was a man named Jacob Guzik. How do I know him? There's a card game, a popular card game, Mafia based, where he's a character. Also, one of his great descendants, like a great niece or something like that, went to camp with me. Same last name. Now, I don't think she was involved in crime, but it's interesting, even though this is a dark thing, what they did, they're part of our family, they're part of our community, and they had families, they had kids, and I went to camp with some of them. So, and again, there's still organized crime today, but when it really counted, and the Jewish people turned to them and said, look, you're a bunch of, cutthroat murderers, but the future of the Jewish people rests on your shoulders. This article talks about at least half a dozen examples where they said, whatever you want, and sent them money every week and got them weapons, whatever they wanted. And we could talk the ethics. Is it worth fighting for Israel if you're going to do it on the backs of murderers? That is a real question to ask. But regardless, these men still recognize that their destiny was tied with the Jewish people. And I think that's actually a very good transition about one's destiny always being for the Jewish people into the idea of piracy. So before we talk about Jewish pirates, any questions up until now? Excellent. And Ed, I didn't mention that even though I have muted, just so people don't hear over each other, if you do have a question, just raise your hand and I'll unmute you, or a comment or anything like that. Now, I said that it was pretty clear what drove Jewish gangsters. Part of it's just, what drove any kind of crime is people's desire for power and money, not necessarily from an evil place. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, but it could start with somebody who thinks they're doing the right thing, but generally it was get out of the ghetto. Well, Jewish piracy also has a pretty clear history, and it comes with one of the darkest moments in Jewish history. And that is two moments. That is the Spanish Inquisition, when hundreds and thousands of Jews were either murdered or forced to convert, and then the ones who would not comply were expelled. The Spanish expulsion. They in kids and many schools, I don't know if they still teach it, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. I think today, both Columbus and the significance of 1492 is shifting in schools, but for Jews, it's always been one of the darkest times in history, because that's when the Jews were expelled from Spain and Portugal. Now, the Jews went all over the world. Many of them went around the Middle East, and that's why Sephardic Jews, the word Sephardic, as opposed to Ashkenazi Jews, comes from Sfarad, which is basically the Hebrew name of Spain. But if you see a Jew who's from Iraq or Morocco or Saudi Arabia, even though there's not really any today, and they call themselves Sephardic, you're like, but that's not where Spain is. Well, they started in Spain and they were expelled. But a significant number of those Jews made their way up north to Norway, to Netherlands, to the Dutch colonies, all of those places. And in fact, one of the biggest communities of Spanish Portuguese Jews, and in fact, one of the vice president of our shul, her family is Spanish Portuguese, were in the Netherlands, because they had escaped from Spain and Portugal and they had set up shop there. Well, the Netherlands, and Norway and all those countries up there were enemies of Spain and Portugal. And they were often fighting with them on the high seas. I mean, the Spanish Armada for a long time was one of the mightiest ones on the earth until Britain became ascendant. But if you're a young Jew who everything you know has either been destroyed, you've been expelled, and you bear this deep hatred for Spain, not just kicking you out, but trying to destroy your very identity, and you move to a country that embraces you, that loves you, and is at war with your enemy, you have a couple options. You could sit back and watch the show, or you can get a piece of the action. And that is indeed what happened with many young Jewish men. They said, I want to stick it to Spain. Some of them just started as merchants, working on ships, working their way up. But many, perhaps if not all of the Jews who became pirates were trying to get vengeance against Spain and Portugal. And it's not just from the Netherlands, not just the Dutch Jews, it's also Jews who went to Jamaica. Hence that book, the Pirates, or the not Pirates of the Caribbean, but Jews of the Caribbean. But again, their impetus is very different from the gangsters. I think part of it is they also wanted to, have a successful career, make a haul, make a living, but a lot of it was an understandable hatred. We have this mitzvah in the Torah to wipe out Amalek. For the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, the nations of Spain and Portugal were Amalek, and it was their job, their right, their mitzvah to go to war with them. So what I want to do now is look at a few of those famous Jewish rabbis, or not rabbis, those Jews who became pirates. And one of the questions you might be thinking is, well, were they all secular like the gangsters? We'll come back to that. So one of the first ones, and I don't know his personal observance, I don't believe he was observant, but I'm not sure, was this man Moses Cohen Enrique, or Enrique, someone, I don't know if someone here could pronounce it better, but in 1628, he was part of this major attack on the Spanish fleet. And if you took the amount of money that they took from Spain, which I'm sure he was very happy to do, and converted it in today's dollars, they took about $1 billion worth of gold and goods. So what did this young Jewish pirate do? He bought himself an island, because that's what you do when you make $1 billion, is you buy yourself an island, live there for many years, and then through one way or the other, he actually ended up working for one of the greatest pirates, not a Jewish one in history, Sir Henry Morgan. So this is just one example of a Jewish pirate. And again, the biggest thing is stick it to the man. Now, again, when he became rich, he bought himself an island. So it's not as simple as vengeance and defending your people, but that really is the strong impetus behind that. And actually, that leads to this next man. He was indeed a rabbi, an Orthodox rabbi, Rabbi Palanch. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce his name. And again, he worked with Dutch trading, and he was a merchant, and he gained a great deal of money. But while most of his work was above board, above the water, as it were, on his ship, and he was a captain of a ship, a Jewish captain of a ship, any chance he could get to stick it to a Spanish ship to attack them, he would definitely take. But what we do know, or it has been quoted from many sources, is of his ship, they only ate kosher food. So he's called the pirate rabbi. Now, again, some of it, as with all these things, are a little bit shrouded in mystery, but this guy had a really good reputation. He was not a cruel individual out just to hurt and maim and become rich. He was a legitimate businessman, as many pirates started at. This class is not about the history of piracy, which is fascinating. An actual pirate ship, when they show mutiny on the Bounty and stuff like that, pirates didn't have mutinies. The way their ship structure was set up, there was this perfect balance of power. Everyone knew their role. There was democratic component to it. But pirate ships generally started out as legitimate businessmen, legitimate sailors who couldn't find another job. So he was a legitimate merchant, but he was a thorn in the side of the Spanish Armada and a hero to many a Jew. But again, this is also indicative of the fact that these men, while not everything they did was good, and their motivations were not always pure, in most cases, if not many, if not all of the case of Jewish pirates, they really were doing it either as a legitimate job or to get vengeance on the Spanish and the Portuguese for what they had done. Any questions up until now? Excellent. One of the interesting questions that came, oh, Susan, you have a question? Yes, I'm going to unmute you before going into
well,
yeah, go ahead, please.
This was a time, the 1600s, when Spain was very much in competition with England, and a lot of the pirates were English. And I don't know about Norwegians, but there were a number of, and I don't know about the Dutch either, but the biggies were the English, I think.
Well, so what I'm saying is that this is one of the reasons that when we heard it, when I said that Moses Enrique, or however his
Uh-huh.
last name is pronounced, we don't really
Uh-huh.
hear about him, but he worked for Sir
Uh-huh.
Henry Morgan. So the thing
Uh-huh.
is that the more well-known pirates were, actually, if you look at Hollywood, they're all Scottish. Every pirate that ever lived is Scottish, but the Jewish ones were not, because the Jews weren't
Yeah.
living in England. They were living in Jamaica. They were living, in the Dutch, not in the colonies, but they were living, in the Northern Europe. That's where the Jews went. That's where the Spanish, Portuguese Jews were living.
Yeah.
And they joined in with, and again, oftentimes, as you said, piracy wasn't huge in those places, but those Jews, they weren't getting into piracy generally for the sake of being pirates. They were doing it out of like an unspeakable hatred towards the Spanish. And it wasn't always, let's burn their ships and murder them. A lot of times it was, competition, legitimate competition. But if they could ever stick it to the Spanish for what the Spanish had done for them, barely a century or about a century earlier, it makes a lot more sense. And again, it looks very different optics than Jewish gangsters, who again, were trying to get a better life, but their motivations were much more questionable. And one of the questions here that's much more relevant, I think, to Jewish pirates than the gangsters, but I think perhaps to both, is there anything in Jewish law that could validate or justify this kind of behavior? And there's a famous story in the Talmud, in the book of Sanhedrin, where they go to King David and they say to him, basically, we're struggling financially. And he goes through this whole thing. The sages have a conversation with him. A single handle of food does not satisfy a lion. Like, we need more food. Like David, it's not enough what we're surviving on. A cistern won't be filled just from the rain that falls in its mouth. Like, you need other sources of water. So too, the nation cannot sustain itself using its own resources. Like, we need to expand. So King David told him, all right, go to war and battle to expand our borders and provide our people. The sages, but this is an important part of the story. Immediately, the sages went to Achitophel, to the priest at the time, and they had him use the special breastplate, the Urim Vitumim, which they say at the end, to make sure that basically God was okay with it, which the pirates and the gangsters probably weren't. But the answer was, look, if you are being threatened, and not just like for your lives, but financially, you need to expand your territory. Go set up some raiding parties. Now, what's different here is the context. By asking a priest, by using the breastplate, those stones that God, had given to us as a mitzvah, it makes it a biblically commanded war, or a biblically permitted war. So it's a little bit different here. However, this might be relevant because the Jewish pirates probably saw themselves as fighting a war against Spain and Portugal, and one that certainly God would permit because of what they had done to our people, and not just the expulsion, but the forced conversions and the torturing. So the pirates probably thought, God must support me on these raidings. There's a history of King David saying raids can be permitted for the sake of the people. This is for the sake of our people. Can you say the same about the gangsters? Probably not, but it's still a very interesting conversation. What times in Jewish law is it permitted to do illegal things for the sake of your nation? One could say any war is illegal, but they're not talking here just about war. They're talking about raiding parties. So if we want to say Jewish gangsters and pirates, it's always verboten, always forbidden, the most evil thing ever. It's not always that simple to say. And that leads to the last thing we're going to do. Is there's a gentleman in LA who worked a number of years ago, created this incredible short film. It's only 10 minutes, and it's called The Pirate Captain Toledano. I purchased it on Amazon Prime. I think I purchased it years ago too, but can't find the original link. But this video explores the whole topic of Jews who are still connected to their Judaism, wanting to join pirates just to get back at the Spanish. So we're going to Now, one could say that perhaps that video took an oversimplified view of history, that Jews just became pirates in order to fight the Spanish. But again, I think it does capture something which history bears out, which is that we have had many enemies, And sometimes we've been too weak to fight them, or we fought them in any way we could. And it just so happened at that moment in history, where the Jews were and the means that were at their hands, it made sense for them to become pirates. Could one argue that perhaps the gangsters also, that was the moment in history when that was where the strength of the Jews were? I don't think as much. However, as I said, when their backs were against the wall and the future of the Jewish people in the land of Israel knew that it was fight or we won't exist anymore, the Jewish gangsters said, we will give you anything. And they did. They put their actual money where their mouths were. These points in history, the 20s and 30s, and then as the 14, 15, and 1600s are fascinating, troubling, challenging times in Jewish history, and they've often been sensationalized. That video was beautiful, and it was, whether it was heart-wrenching or was just inspiring, again, it's been sensationalized. It's important to dig under the truth and really understand it, but these are also moments in history that we do need to study, that we do need to look behind the pale, because they explore the moments in history when Jews said, enough, I am going to fight back. And how appropriate that we are having this class during the time of Hanukkah, because the Maccabees to the Romans were seen as no more than pirates, gangsters, terrorists, but they were fighting for something so much more. They were fighting for the very soul of our people. They were fighting to make sure that we did have a future. They were fighting because they could. They were fighting because they had the strength. And we have too many times in history been too weak, too oppressed to be able to fight back. But we look for those moments of inspiration. And there are a handful of men like the Maccabees, like the pirate rabbi, who not only fought back, but did it as good human beings and inspired us. And there's some who fought back, and unfortunately, they'll let the power take them on a darker path. But regardless, they're a part of our people and they're a part of our cycle, but they remind us that no matter what we are going through, we have an incredible strength. We have an incredible power given to us by God and shown throughout history. And we celebrate that on Hanukkah, whether it be our pirate brothers or our wayward gangster Jewish brothers. But it's so important to recognize how important that is to history, and that we are not a weak people. We're a people who can fight. So with that, I wish everyone a Hanukkah Sameach,